The crowd had come to watch a queen who wasn't there yet, and by the end of the afternoon they would leave believing they had already met her. Nobody in Valdoria said that out loud. Not on the morning of the Founding Day procession, when the streets of the capital filled so early that bakers ran out of bread by 9 and children were lifted onto shoulders so they could see over the crowd. The banners hung from every window, deep green and silver, the colors of the royal house, snapping in a wind that came off the river and carried the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. People had waited 3 days in some cases, sleeping in doorways and on the wide stone steps of the old cathedral just to hold a place along the route. They told each other they had come for tradition, for the horses, the music, the golden carriage that only left the palace once a year. But if you had asked them quietly, one at a time, many of them would have admitted the truth. They had come to see the two women, and they had come to see which one the country still belonged to. For 30 years, that answer had been simple. It had been Lady Rosamond. She was not a queen, and she had never pretended to be one. Her title was smaller than that, older, harder to explain to outsiders. She was the widow of the late king's brother, which made her the second most senior woman in the royal house and gave her a claim to no throne at all. But titles were only the frame of a picture. What filled the frame was influence, and for 3 decades Rosamond had owned more of it than anyone in Valdoria. She had buried a husband, raised the young king when his own mother grew too ill to do it, and stood at the center of every important room in the kingdom for so long that people had stopped noticing she was standing there. She was simply part of the architecture. When she entered a hall, conversations shifted toward her the way water tilts toward the low corner of a table. When she was displeased, ministers found their proposals quietly delayed. When she approved of a young courtier, that courtier's future opened like a door. She had never needed to raise her voice, because for 30 years no one had ever made her. Now she was 61, and something had begun to change, and she could feel it the way you feel a draft in a house you have lived in your whole life. You cannot always find the crack. You only know the warmth is leaving. The crack had a name, and the name was Alara. Princess Alara had not been born royal. She had married into the family 8 years earlier, a young woman from a respectable but unremarkable family in the northern provinces, chosen by Prince Aldrich for reasons the court had spent years failing to fully understand. She was not the most beautiful woman to have entered the palace, though she was striking in a calm, unhurried way. She was not the wittiest, nor the most highly born, nor the richest. In the beginning, Rosamond had barely registered her, a pretty northern girl who blushed at state dinners and mispronounced the names of the old families. Rosamond had been almost kind to her, in the way that a lioness is almost kind to something too small to bother eating. She had given Alara advice, corrected her posture, told her which duchesses to flatter and which to avoid, and had privately expected the girl to remain, forever, a decorative figure standing 3 steps behind the people who mattered. That was the miscalculation of Rosamond's life. She had watched Alara for 8 years and never once understood what she was watching. Because Alara had done something that court women almost never did. She had stayed quiet, not out of shyness, though everyone assumed it was shyness. She had stayed quiet the way a good gardener stays quiet through a long winter, doing the slow, invisible work that no one applauds, so that when spring finally comes the whole garden seems to bloom at once, and people say what a miracle, as if it had happened by accident. For 8 years, Alara had visited hospitals when the cameras were not there. She had learned the names of the palace staff, all of them, from the head chamberlain down to the girl who lit the lamps, and she remembered their children's names too. She had refused, gently and without ever making a scene, to join the small cruelties that court women used to keep score against one another. She had absorbed 1,000 insults and returned none of them. And slowly, without a single announcement, the country had fallen in love with her, and almost no one at the palace had noticed until it was already done. Rosamond had noticed. Late, but she had noticed. And that was why, on the morning of the Founding Day procession, The older woman stood at the tall window of her private apartments and watched the crowds gathering below with an expression that her maid had learned not to comment on. "They're early," Rosamund said. It was not really a remark. It was a way of testing her own voice, of making sure it still sounded like her. "Very early, my lady," the maid agreed. "The whole city, it looks like." Rosamund said nothing to that. She was watching a particular banner, hung from a balcony across the square, that someone had painted by hand. It was not the official banner of the royal house. It showed, in clumsy but loving brushwork, a single silver flower, the northern winter rose, the flower that grew in the province Alara had come from, the flower that had, in the past 2 or 3 years, become something people wore on their coats and pinned to their children's collars without anyone ever telling them to. Nobody had decreed it. It had simply spread, the way a song spreads, until one morning it was everywhere and no one could remember it not being there. There was no winter rose that belonged to Rosamund. There never had been. She had ruled through fear and favor and the long memory of who owed her what, and those things did not grow on balconies. She understood, standing at that window, that you could hold a kingdom by the throat for 30 years and still watch it give its heart, quietly and completely, to someone who had never once asked for it. "Have my carriage brought up," she said. "The green gown, not the gray." "The gray is very fine, my lady." "The green." Rosamund turned from the window. "Today I will not be difficult to see." The maid did not understand what that meant, and Rosamund did not explain. She had understood some weeks before that a war was coming. Not a war with soldiers. A quieter war, the kind fought in the space of a single afternoon in front of 100,000 people, decided by nothing more than who the crowd chose to look at. She had spent her whole life winning exactly this kind of war. She did not intend to lose the last one without a fight. Across the palace, in apartments smaller and simpler than Rosamund's, Alara was being dressed for the same procession, and she was thinking about none of these things. She was thinking about a letter. It had arrived 2 days earlier, unsigned, slipped among the ordinary correspondence in a way that meant someone inside the palace had placed it there. The letter had been short and cruel and precise, the way only anonymous letters can be. It told her that she did not belong, that the country's affection for her was a fashion, a passing thing, and that fashions end. It told her that on founding day the old families would be watching, the people who truly ran Veldoria, and that they were not charmed by hospital visits and hand-painted flowers. It warned her, in language that pretended to be friendly advice, to remember her place and to keep 3 steps back, where a woman like her belonged. Alara had read the letter twice, folded it, and placed it in the small locked box where she kept the few things she did not want anyone to see. She had not cried. She had not shown it to her husband, who would have raged and demanded an investigation, and turned a small ugly thing into a court scandal that would have hurt them both. She had simply sat with it quietly, the way she sat with all difficult things, and she had come to a decision that she told no one. She was not going to keep 3 steps back. Not out of pride. Alara had very little pride of the ordinary kind, but she had spent 8 years watching how the palace worked, watching who was rewarded and who was ground down, watching Rosamund in particular move through rooms like weather, changing the temperature of every gathering she touched. And Alara had come to understand something that the letter's writer had not intended to teach her. The country did not need another woman who ruled by fear. It had one of those already, and it was tired. What it wanted, what it had been quietly reaching toward, without knowing how to say so, was something it had almost forgotten was possible. It wanted to be led by someone who was not afraid of it, someone who liked it. Someone who could stand in front of 100,000 strangers and make each one of them feel, for a single moment, that they had been seen. Alara did not know if she could be that person, but she had decided to find out today. "You're very calm, ma'am," said the young woman helping her dress, a girl named Paya whose mother worked in the palace kitchens and whom Alara had known for years. "I'd be sick with nerves." "I am sick with nerves," Alara said and smiled, and it was true, but she said it so lightly that Paya laughed. The trick is not to let the nerves drive the carriage. You can let them ride along. You just don't hand them the reins. Did someone teach you that? My grandmother, she kept bees. Alara turned to check the fall of her gown in the mirror. It was a soft, deep green, almost the color of the royal house but not quite, a shade or two warmer, and pinned at her shoulder was a single silver winter rose. She had chosen it herself. She used to say the bees can always tell when you're afraid of them, so you learn to move slow and breathe slow and go about your work as if they were friends. And after a while, you look up and realize you've stopped being afraid, and you never noticed the moment it happened. And that works with bees. It works with almost everything, Alara said. That has a great many small parts and can sting you if it turns. Paya did not understand that she had just been told exactly what Alara intended to do to a crowd of 100,000 people. Almost no one understood Alara until afterward. That was the whole secret of her, and it was a secret she kept simply by never explaining it. The procession was to begin at noon. By 11:30, the royal party had assembled in the great courtyard, and the tension there was so thick that even the horses felt it, tossing their heads and stamping on the old stones. The young king was there, pale and dutiful, a decent man who had never quite grown into the size of his crown. His mother, the dowager queen, too frail now to ride, watched from a covered chair. Prince Aldrich stood beside his wife, and every few moments he glanced at her with a worry he could not name. And moving among them all, greeting each one, arranging each one, subtly placing herself at the exact center of the group so that any painter or any crowd would naturally see her first, was Lady Rosamond in her green gown, magnificent and terrible, and though no one would have dared say it, just slightly afraid. She came to Alara last. She always did. It was one of her small cruelties, the ordering of her greetings, and Alara had long ago stopped minding it. "My dear," Rosamond said, taking both of Alara's hands in the warm two-handed clasp she used on people she intended to destroy. "How lovely you look. Green suits you, though I confess I'm surprised you didn't wear something a little brighter. On a day like today one does want to be noticed." Her eyes flicked just once to the silver flower at Alara's shoulder and something cold moved behind them. "Still, very sweet, very simple, exactly right for you." It was a beautiful insult. Every word of it was a knife, and every knife was wrapped in silk, and it was delivered so quietly and so warmly that the people standing 3 feet away heard only a kind older woman complimenting a younger one. Rosamond had been building insults like that for 40 years. They were her finest craft. Alara looked at her for a moment, and then she did something that Rosamond had never once, in 8 years, seen her do. She smiled, not the soft, deflecting smile she used to absorb blows, but a different smile, slower and steadier and somehow enormous, a smile that reached all the way up into her eyes and stayed there. And she squeezed Rosamond's hands gently in return, as if the two of them were old friends sharing a private joke, and she said, in a voice pitched low enough that only Rosamond could hear it, "Thank you, Rosamond, I've learned so much from you," a pause, "about being noticed." And she let go of the older woman's hands, and turned, and walked toward the open carriage that waited to carry the royal women into the greatest crowd Valdoria had seen in a generation. Rosamond stood very still in the courtyard in her green gown, and felt, for the first time in 30 years, the specific cold sensation of a door beginning, very slowly, to close. She did not yet know how far it would swing. None of them did. The horses were led forward, the great gates began to part, and beyond them the roar of 100,000 voices rose up to meet the royal party like the sea coming in. Somewhere in that roar was the answer to the only question that had ever mattered in Valdoria, and in a very short while, in front of everyone, that answer was going to change. The gates opened, and the noise hit them like a physical thing. Alara had been in crowds before. She had waved from balconies, ridden in processions, stood on platforms while thousands cheered. but she had never felt anything like the wall of sound that met the royal carriages as they came out through the palace gates and onto the wide avenue that ran down toward the river. It was not a single roar. It was 100,000 separate voices, and when you listened, and Alara had trained herself over 8 years to actually listen, you could hear that they were not all cheering the same thing. Some were cheering the king. Some were cheering the horses, the spectacle, the pure excitement of being alive in a great crowd on a great day. And some, more than a few, were calling a single name, and the name was hers. The carriages moved slowly, at walking pace, so that the people could see. Rosamond rode in the first carriage with the Dowager Queen, a place of high honor she had arranged for herself weeks in advance. Alara rode in the second, with 2 of the king's young cousins, girls of 14 and 16 who were half wild with nerves and excitement. And as the procession moved down the avenue, something became visible that changed the mood inside both carriages, though the 2 women reacted to it in completely opposite ways. The winter roses were everywhere. Not the official banners of the royal house, though those hung from the lampposts as they were supposed to, but in the hands of the people, pinned to their coats, painted on scraps of cloth and held up over their heads, were the silver flowers of the north. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. As the carriages passed, people held them higher, and here and there along the route the crowd began to do something no one had planned and no one had ordered, something that spread down the avenue ahead of the carriages like fire running along a fuse. They began to hold the flowers up as Alara passed, and to fall for a moment, almost quiet, not silent, but softer, a strange tender hush moving through the roar, and then to say her name altogether in a way that was less a cheer than a greeting. As if 100,000 strangers were each, individually, saying hello to a friend. In the first carriage, Rosamond saw it, and her face did not change, because she had spent 61 years learning not to let her face change. But her hands, folded in her lap, closed slowly into fists. In the second carriage, Alara saw it, and for a moment she could not breathe. The 16-year-old cousin beside her, Princess Sona, grabbed her arm. "They love you," Sona whispered. "Aunt Alara, listen, they love you." "They love the day," Alara said gently, but her own voice was not quite steady. "They love the music and the horses and each other. Don't ever mistake a crowd's happiness for a crowd's love. They're not the same thing, and confusing them is how people at this palace lose their way." But even as she said it, she knew it was not the whole truth. Something was happening, something she had hoped for and half believed in and did not entirely trust. She made herself breathe slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her, slow and even, moving among the bees. She raised her hand and waved, not the stiff practiced wave of royalty but something smaller and truer, catching individual eyes in the crowd, holding them for just a heartbeat each, and each person she looked at seemed to light up as if a lamp had been turned on inside them. That was the thing Alara could do that no amount of Rosamund's power could imitate. She could make a single stranger, for 1 second, feel like the only person in the world. And in a crowd of 100,000, that 1 second, multiplied and passed along and told about later to husbands and children, was worth more than 30 years of fear. The procession reached the great square before the cathedral, where a raised platform had been built for the royal party. Here the crowd was thickest and the noise was greatest. The plan Rosamund had helped design weeks ago. In a committee she had of course dominated, was simple and had been followed for 100 years. The royal party would climb the platform. The king would speak a few words. The Dowager Queen would be honored. And then the senior royal women would step forward in order of precedence to receive the acclaim of the people. In order of precedence. Which meant Rosamund first, and Alara, married in, northern-born, lowest of the senior women, last. 3 steps back, exactly as the anonymous letter had promised. Rosamund had counted on that order the way a general counts on high ground. Let the crowd love the girl in the streets. On the platform, in front of the old families and the ministers and the foreign ambassadors, the order would remind everyone of the truth. First, the woman who had run Veldoria for 30 years, and somewhere behind her, in her sweet, simple green, the pretty northern girl who did not belong. But two things happened on that platform that no committee had planned. The first was the wind. It had been building all morning, the wind off the river, carrying the rain that had not yet fallen. As the royal party climbed onto the high exposed platform, the wind rose suddenly and hard, snapping the banners straight out, and the sky over the river went from gray to a deep bruised purple. And the Dowager Queen, old, frail, already exhausted by the long, slow ride, swayed on her feet at the top of the steps, her hand going to her chest, her face going white. For one terrible second no one moved. The king froze. The ministers stared. Rosamund, who was closest, who was standing exactly where she had arranged to be standing, in the place of highest honor at the front, Rosamund hesitated. It was only a heartbeat, but it was the wrong heartbeat, and 100,000 people were watching, and later no one would be able to say exactly why the great Lady Rosamund, in the moment that the old queen faltered, did not move. Perhaps she was afraid of the crowd. Perhaps 30 years of being served had left her unpracticed at serving. Perhaps she simply froze the way anyone can freeze. But she froze. Ilara did not. Ilara was 3 steps back, exactly where precedence had placed her. And from 3 steps back she moved, fast and low and certain, across the platform, and she reached the swaying old woman before the queen's knees had finished buckling, and she caught her. Not gently, there was no time to be gentle. She caught the Dowager Queen under the arms and took her whole weight and held her up. And then, because the old woman was too weak to stand and too proud to be seen to fall, Ilara did something that made the entire square gasp aloud. She lowered herself down, right there on the high platform in front of 100,000 people, and she knelt, and she let the old queen sit against her, held safe in her arms, so that the dowager was not lying on the ground like a fallen thing but resting, cradled, dignified, like a mother in the arms of a daughter. And then Ilara looked up, not at the ministers, not at the ambassadors, not at Rosamund frozen 3 feet away, but out at the crowd, at all of them. And in a voice that should not have carried but somehow did, a clear, calm voice with no fear in it at all, she called out, "She's all right, she's just tired. She has given you 70 years. She held the old woman closer. Give her a moment and give her your quiet and she'll stand again. Veldoria always stands again." The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that square had ever heard. 100,000 people went still. The wind dropped as if it too were listening. And in that vast held breath, the old Dowager Queen, rallied by Ilara's steadiness, by the strong young arms holding her up, by the simple animal comfort of not being alone, took a breath and another and got her feet back under her and rose. Slowly. With Ilara rising beside her, one arm still around her, steadying without seeming to steady, giving the old woman the gift of standing on her own in front of her people while making absolutely certain she could not fall. And the square erupted. It was not the roar of before. It was something bigger and rougher and far more dangerous to Rosamund than any cheer, because you cannot buy it and you cannot arrange it and you cannot inherit it. It was the sound of 100,000 people who have just watched, with their own eyes, a person show them exactly who she is. They screamed Ilara's name. They wept, some of them openly, the way people weep at weddings and homecomings. They held the silver flowers up until the whole square was a field of them, tossing in the returning wind. And the noise went on and on and on, and it did not die down, because there was nothing left in that square to make it die down. And through all of it, Lady Rosamund stood exactly where she had arranged to stand, in the place of highest honor, at the front, alone, in her magnificent green gown in the loudest silence of her life, watching 100,000 people fall completely and finally in love with the woman she had spent 8 years failing to see. Watching the crown of her influence, invisible, unofficial, never spoken of, worn for 30 years, lift gently off her head in the river wind and settle, without a single word being said, onto the shoulders of the northern girl who had knelt on the platform and caught a falling queen. She understood it. That was the worst part. Rosamond was not a stupid woman. She had never been stupid, only cruel, and cruelty and stupidity are not the same. She understood, standing there, that something had ended, and that it had ended not because she had been defeated in the way she knew how to be defeated, not by scheme or scandal or a stronger enemy, but by something she had no defense against at all. She had been made irrelevant by an act of simple goodness performed at exactly the right moment in front of exactly the right number of people. There was no countermove for that. There was no committee she could dominate, no favor she could withhold, no silken insult she could wrap around a knife. You cannot punish a woman for catching a queen. You can only stand beside it and watch and feel the warmth leave the house you have lived in your whole life. The king came forward at last, too late to matter, and helped his grandmother to her chair. The ministers surged in. The moment broke apart into activity. But the thing that had happened, and everyone on that platform knew it, and everyone in that square knew it, and by nightfall everyone in Valdoria would know it too. Alara stepped back, not 3 steps, just one, quietly, to give the king his space with the old queen. And as she stepped back, her eyes found Rosamond's across the platform for the second time that day. Rosamond looked at her, and Alara looked back, and there was no triumph in her face, none at all. That was the thing Rosamond would think about for a long time afterward, lying awake in the dark. There was no victory in the girl's eyes. There was only a kind of quiet, steady understanding, and something that on a less proud woman Rosamond might almost have called compassion. As if Alara knew exactly what had just been taken, and from whom, and was sorry for the cost of it, even as she did not for one moment give it back. The rain, which had been coming all morning, finally began to fall, soft at first, then harder, silver in the gray light, and the crowd did not run for shelter. The crowd stayed and lifted its faces and its flowers and its voice into the rain. The rain kept the city awake half the night, and so did the talking. By morning, there was not a house in Valdoria where the story had not been told, and in the telling it had already begun to change and grow, the way true stories do when a whole country takes hold of them at once. In the version the fishermen told down at the docks, Alara had lifted the old queen clean off her feet with one arm. In the version the schoolteachers told, she had spoken for a full minute of perfect wisdom. In the version the children told, there had been a clap of thunder at the exact moment she knelt. None of it was quite what had happened. All of it was true in the way that matters more than facts. A country had watched a woman become who she was going to be, and it had decided, overnight and altogether, to love her for it without reservation and without end. At the palace, the mood was stranger and quieter. Power had moved in the night, everyone could feel it, and no one was yet sure how to behave. The ministers who had for years arranged their mornings around Lady Rosamond's preferences found themselves, without quite deciding to, drifting instead toward the apartments of the northern princess. Not to ask for anything, just to be near her, just to be, in some small way, on the right side of the door that everyone now understood had swung open. It is an ugly thing to watch, the speed with which a court reassigns its loyalty, and Alara watched it with a clear and unhappy eye, because she understood exactly what it was worth. People who transfer their loyalty in a single night will transfer it again just as fast the moment the wind changes. She did not despise them for it. But she did not trust it either, and she did not let it turn her head, and that steadiness, that refusal to be intoxicated by her own sudden rise, was, though she did not think of it that way, the final proof that the crown had settled on the right shoulders. She spent the morning where she always spent it, not receiving the ministers who had come to bow, with the Dowager Queen. The old woman had slept badly and woken frightened, the way the very old wake after a fall, uncertain of their own bodies. And Alara came and sat with her, not as a princess, and not as the woman the whole country was now talking about, but simply as someone who had held her in the rain and wanted to know she was all right. She brought no attendants. She poured the tea herself. She talked about small things, the garden, the weather, a scandal among the palace cats, until the old queen laughed and some of the fear went out of her face. "You saved my life on that platform," the dowager said at last quietly, when the laughing was done. "You'd only fainted," Alara said. "You'd have been fine." Would have fallen in front of all of them, an old woman dropped like a sack on the stones at the end of a long life of trying to be dignified. The queen's hand found Alara's and held it, papery and cool and surprisingly strong. "You didn't just catch me, child, you made it beautiful. You turned my worst moment into something they'll tell their grandchildren. I don't know how you knew to do that. I don't know how anyone knows to do that." She studied Alara's face. Rosamund never knew. 30 years, and she never once knew. Alara said nothing. It was not her way to speak against Rosamund, not even now, not even to the queen. But the old woman saw the silence and understood it and nodded slowly. "She'll be waiting to see you," the dowager said. "Rosamund, she'll want to take your measure now that everything's different. Be careful with her, Alara. A snake is never so dangerous as the day after you've cut off half its length. Half a snake still has all its teeth." "I'm not afraid of her," Alara said, and found, a little to her own surprise, that it was simply true. "No," the queen agreed, watching her. "No, I don't believe you are. That's the whole of it, isn't it? That's the thing she can't forgive you for. Not that they love you. She could survive being unloved. She's done it her whole life. It's that you're not afraid, and everyone else always was." The summons came that afternoon, though it did not come as a summons. Rosamund was far too clever for that. It came as an invitation, warm and gracious, delivered by a servant. Would the princess do her the honor of taking tea, privately, just the two of them, so that they might talk as family should? Alara read it and understood every layer of it. It was an act of submission dressed as an act of grace. By inviting Alara, Rosamund was conceding that Alara was now the one who granted or withheld her presence. But by making it seem like a generous elder reaching out to a younger woman, she was trying to keep, in the very shape of the meeting, one last shred of the old order. It was masterful. It was pathetic. It was, Alara thought, the move of a woman who had spent her whole life playing a game so well that she no longer knew how to do anything else, even when the game was over and she had lost. Alara went. Rosamund received her in the tall apartments with the window over the square, the same window where she had stood the morning before and watched the crowds gather. She had dressed carefully, in gray this time, not green, and Alara noted it and understood it. The woman who had said today, "I will not be difficult to see," had chosen, the very next day, to make herself smaller. There was tea laid out, and cakes, and every courtesy, and for a while the two women spoke of nothing, of the rain and the queen's health and the tiresome length of the procession, circling the real thing the way two people circle a grave. It was Rosamund who broke first. That in itself was extraordinary. In 30 years, Rosamund had never broken first at anything. "You planned it," she said. She said it flatly, almost admiringly, setting down her cup. "The flower, the gown, that particular green, close to the house colors but not quite, so that on the platform you'd read as one of us and one of them at the same time. Standing 3 back where you could see the whole party and no one could see you. You planned all of it." "I planned the flower and the gown," Alara said. She saw no reason to lie. "I planned to be seen. You told me to in the courtyard, don't you remember? You said one does want to be noticed." A faint smile. "I took your advice." Rosamund's mouth tightened. "And the queen? Did you plan for the queen to fall?" "No," Alara's voice changed, went quiet and serious. "No, I would never, you can't think I—" "No," Rosamund said after a moment, looking at her. "No, I don't think you did. That's what I keep turning over, you see. That's what I can't get past. If you had planned it, I would understand you. I have planned 100 things like it. I would know exactly what you were and I could hate you cleanly and sleep well." She laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "But you didn't plan it. The The queen fell by chance in the one moment when the whole world was watching, and I froze, and you moved. And the difference between us, 30 years of difference, everything I have ever built and everything you have ever been, the whole difference came down to a single second, and in that second I thought about myself and you thought about her. That's all it was. That's all it ever is, isn't it? That's the thing I never learned and you were simply born knowing. Ilara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the tall window, the light was going gold over the wet rooftops, the city drying out after the rain. You could learn it, she said at last. It isn't too late, it's never as late as people think. Don't, Rosamund said sharply. Don't be kind to me, I can survive anything but that. But there was no real venom in it, and she looked older when she had said it and smaller, a woman of 61 in a gray gown at the end of a very long war. What happens now, she said. That's what you came to hear, and I won't pretend I don't know it. What happens to me now? Everyone's already asking. The ministers, the old families, whether the great Lady Rosamund is finished. Whether they should keep bowing or find a new god. She lifted her chin, and for a moment the old iron was back in her, the thing that had ruled a kingdom for 30 years. So, you have the whole country in your hand as of yesterday afternoon. You have the crowd, the queen, the ministers, the story. You have everything I spent my life gathering, and you got it in a single second in the rain. Tell me what you mean to do with it. Tell me what you mean to do with me. And here was the moment. Ilara understood it completely. Everyone was watching, even though no one was in the room. What she did with Rosamund now would tell Veldoria what kind of power she was going to be. She could crush the older woman, it would be easy and no one would blame her, and it would be a lesson to every enemy she would ever have. Or she could be weak and forgive too much and let a wounded snake keep all its teeth. The court expected one or the other, cruelty or foolishness. Those were the only two kinds of power the palace had ever known. Ilara chose a third thing, because she had never in her life let other people's small imaginations set the size of her choices. I'm not going to do anything to you, Rosamund, she said. I'm not going to break you and I'm not going to save you. You've spent 30 years deciding other people's places for them, and I think that's exactly the thing that has to end, and I'm not going to end it by doing the same thing back to you. She leaned forward. Here's what's true. The country has changed. It changed yesterday, and it isn't changing back, and you and I both know it. The old way, the fear, the favors, the long memory of who owes what, it's over. Not because I ended it, because they ended it. 100,000 people ended it in the rain because they were tired of it, and I just happened to be standing where the light fell. She held the older woman's gaze. You can fight that. You can spend whatever years you have left trying to claw back a thing that's already gone, and you'll be miserable, and you'll lose, and you'll die bitter and alone in these beautiful rooms. Or, Rosamund said, her voice was not quite steady. Or you can do the one thing you've never done. You can be useful. You know this palace better than anyone alive. You know every family, every debt, every crack in every wall. All that knowledge you used for 30 years to make people afraid, you could use it now to make things work, quietly, behind the door, not as the woman everyone bows to, as the woman who actually knows how the thing is built. Ilara sat back. I won't pretend it's the same. It isn't. You'll never stand at the front of the platform again. But you could matter, Rosamund, in a way that's real, right up until the end. Or you could rule nothing and no one and spend your last years hatting a girl in a green dress. It's the only choice left that's actually yours. Everything else was decided in the rain. The silence stretched out long. Somewhere below in the square, a street musician had begun to play, and a few voices were singing. And though the words did not carry up to the tall window, it was, unmistakably, a song about a silver flower. Rosamund listened to it. Then she looked at the young woman sitting across from her, this northern girl she had watched for 8 years and never once understood, who had taken everything from her without cruelty, and now offered her the one thing Rosamund had never once offered another living soul, a way to keep her dignity, on the far side of defeat, that she had done nothing to deserve. You're a strange creature, Rosamund said slowly. Do you know that? In 30 years at this court I have never met anyone I could not predict, and I cannot predict you at all. It's the most unsettling thing that has ever happened to me." "I know," Elara said and smiled and stood. "Take the tea things away when you're done and think about what I said. There's no hurry. The door's open either way. It'll still be open tomorrow." She paused at the threshold. "You told me once that on a day like Founding Day one does want to be noticed. You were right, but you left out the important part and I only worked it out yesterday on the platform with the Queen in my arms." She looked back. "It isn't about being noticed at all, Rosamund. It's about what they see when they finally look." And she left quietly, the way she did everything, and Lady Rosamund sat alone in the golden light with the cooling tea, and the song drifting up from the square. And after a very long time, longer than she would ever admit to anyone, she reached up slowly and unpinned from her own gray collar the small thing she had put there that morning and told herself she would never wear. A single silver winter rose. She turned it over in her fingers once in the fading light. And then, alone, where no one could see her and no one would ever know, the woman who had ruled Veldoria for 30 years and lost it all in a single second in the rain, put the flower back on. And she looked out the tall window at the city that no longer belonged to her, and did not, this time, close her hand into a fist. Down in the square, the singing went on into the evening, and the rain, having said what it came to say, did not fall again that night.